Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Voyles. I'm one of the adult services librarians here at the Leesburg Public Library. And the reason why the program I'm doing today, as well as the one I did last week, I thought it would be beneficial to the community and to those who were interested in the exhibit to kind of offer some kind of parallel information in association with the concept of the exhibit, the Voices and Votes in Democracy in America. The program I decided to do today is titled Design Flaws of Our Democracy. And what I'm going to kind of go over is I'm going to introduce the idea of democracy, where it came from, and essentially how America became the heir to that kind of institution and concept, and explore what's unique about American democracy. And then moving forward from that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to present several problems that we often encounter during our political process, that challenge what the concept of democracy is in America. Not everyone may agree that these are problems. Not everyone may agree that, that they're necessarily something to be fixed. But these are definitely something that these are the things that are most pertinent in public discourse. They're constantly talked about every time there's an election cycle. Anytime someone talks about the government and politics, these are kind of the most important issues that are talked about and things that need to be addressed to the public and to the government as a whole. So starting at the beginning, the very beginning, what the origins of democracy, what it is it started in ancient Greece. Athens is the birthplace of democracy, is considered in global history. Democracy, in its basic concept, is a system of government in which power is vested in the people. And you can see that in the actual word itself. It's made up of demos, which is people, and kratos, which is rule, and that's ancient Greek for that. And looking at ancient Greece, and specifically with Athens, not everywhere in ancient Greece, what democracy was a direct democracy. It's not something that we are necessarily familiar with today and how they functioned, because they were a city-state, and most governments and societies today are much larger than that. So they operated as a city-state. Where individuals who were considered citizens, not everyone was a citizen. It was restricted to free men, not women, not slaves, not people who were from outside of Athens. These are the people that participated. They met and assembled, and it was as chaotic or as rule as you may think it is. Orderly, I should say, as you may think it is, where all the men in the city just gathered and they would present issues, and then they would literally vote on those issues. This was as direct as it can be. And that's essentially where democracy comes from, is them deciding that they were going to decide things for themselves. Then we move to the Roman Republic. So Rome is often considered the successor to Athenian philosophy and government. And the Roman Republic is res publica, which means public affair. It kind of advanced the idea of what democracy was into something more abstract. It's not just a bunch of men sitting in a room casting votes for something that directly related to them. It kind of added another layer to it, where because Rome was vastly larger than Athens and ancient Greece was, they operated on a system of elective representatives. So people, the citizens of Rome, would elect someone who then would go to the government in Rome and be the ones that voted on the issues at hand. And this is where we kind of see the influence of our system that we have today, because we are not a pure democracy. We don't, in some aspects we do, I should say, in the very local aspects, we do directly vote for things. But we do, our system is set up as a republic where we do vote for people to vote for us. And that's kind of where the origins come from in Rome. And then moving along, one of the most significant kind of developments in Democracy in our tradition, our Western tradition, was the Magna Carta in England. England, they were our ancestors. They are the ones that came over to the New World, and eventually we developed into our own nation. But stretching all the way back to English law, it was a monarchy in England, in many places in the world. And this is where when the Magna Carta was signed in 1215, it's where authority started being limited by these absolutists, these rulers, where the idea of a constitutional democracy, a constitutional authority, where there is here's a document, you have to abide by this document, kind of started developed. And that's where we kind of get a lot of our inspiration for how our government and our political documents kind of started coming about. And then kind of jumping another 500 years, we have the Age of Enlightenment. This is a time period in Europe where a lot of philosophers kind of started thinking about new concepts of how society and people interact with each other, how government is involved in our lives. This is where individual rights and social contracts, as well as the separation of powers, where there's a division where this person does that, this person does this. And that's where, you have people like John Locke and Montesquieu and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. These French and English philosophers are the ones that directly influenced our founders. So the people, who wrote our Declaration of Independence, declared a revolution, wrote our Constitution, literally looked at the writings of these people and said, these guys had it right. And we need to actually apply what they theorized into practice, into our purpose of what our government is going to be. And that's exactly what happened. So they, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, these men were very learned and knew, these people and their writings and their ideas, and wanted to apply it in a practical sense to see if it could actually work. And that's often why American democracy and the American Republic and our revolution was considered an experiment, because it was the first time that we would see this happen. So kind of moving forward from what inspired American democracy, now we're going to talk about what actually is American democracy and what unfolded, upon the revolution. I mentioned before the difference between a democracy and a republic. What we have is a constitutional republic. We're not just a pure democracy. That's just a pretty abstract term when talking about how we run our country and what our politics are. We are a democracy, but in a very abstract sense. In the nitty-gritty technical sense, we are a constitutional republic. The Constitution, it provides the framework for government for this constitutional republic, because it's not just people voting in a room. We have a set of rules that we do follow when we are making laws and following them. The United States is a collection of states operating under a federal system. It's called federalism. And what it essentially is that there are individual states who agreed to kind of unify and to form a national government. This is something that was entrenched in the beginnings of our country before the Constitution came about. The idea of, who does what, who has what authority. So that's kind of always been a present issue in our early republic of this. You have the states, and then you have the national government. Going even further, there's the idea of separation of powers that was discussed in the philosophy of the Enlightenment, where we put it into practice in our Constitution, in our government. We have an executive branch for the president, we have a legislative branch for the Congress, and then we have a judiciary branch for the Supreme Court and courts in general. So the idea of separation of powers, it's not just authority coming from one single king or monarch or emperor or something, or even just a governing body, one single governing body. The idea is that there is a separation of powers to provide a checks and balances, so that we can maintain the republic, maintain this idea of democracy, that not one person can usurp it and essentially roll it back, to saying that that they can't change it back to where we came from. At its core, the base principles of American democracy are popular sovereignty, individual rights, and equal representation. Popular sovereignty is us deciding what we want we get to vote on things like, we want this to happen, so we get to vote on that. Individual rights, something that is, when we first kind of started as a country, is not something that was applicable really to a lot of people. I should say a lot of nations. Individual rights are things that, me as an individual, I can do certain things like, I'm protected. The government can't punish me, or, society can't punish me for doing these things. It's a matter of these kinds of things are protected by the individual and not by the state or even the federal government. Citizens do have a right to vote. They can participate in free and fair elections, and they can influence public policy. A unique aspect of our republic and why it stands out from a pure democracy is that there is an emphasis on the prevention of a tyranny of the majority. So when we're talking about a pure democracy, it's 51% decides everything. It's majority rules. But what's written and codified into our laws is that in a lot of aspects, yes, 51% means a-okay. But what it is that, talking about individual rights, is there is a protection aspect of it for the minority, for that 49%, where it's not necessarily that, 51% decides everything. It's that 51% can do X, Y, Z, but as long as it's not infringing upon the 49%. There's a lot of nuance in it in terms of how it applies across the board, whether it's the national government or individual states. But it is something that is uniquely American and obviously adopted in later democracies and republics to protect essentially the tyranny of the majority. While the United States has made significant strides towards a more inclusive democracy, because we talked about in ancient Athens where it was just pretty much free men, it's essentially the same thing how we were set up. It was landed white men who were in this country that were pretty much the only ones that were considered citizens. They're the only ones that actually had a say, could vote. We have made significant strides in the over 250, almost 250 years since then. Where, that we do still continue to be challenged by, test the effectiveness and the inclusivity of our democracy. We do strive to ensure that all voices are heard through achieving the ideal, making sure that the ideal remains from the Enlightenment, from Athens, from Rome. It's a whole successorship of our country where we kind of pull the best ideas. And that's the idea, is that we are striving always to make sure that the principles that are laid out are equally applied to everyone. Like I mentioned before, there are still challenges today. 50 years ago, there were challenges then. 100 years ago, even more challenges. It just gets less and less and less. And the whole idea of this presentation going forward is that I'm going to kind of discuss these pertinent challenges that do face our democracy today. And at the end, discuss maybe possible what kind of solutions that there might be for those problems. So one of the first issues, and probably one that a lot of people are familiar with, is partisanship and polarization. Partisanship is a strong allegiance to one's own political party. Political parties are something that, developed naturally in our country, not by law or anything. It's just a matter of people grouping together based on common principles and political goals. The idea of partisanship is that, everyone kind of sticks to their own. Often the decisions are made based on party loyalty rather for the greater good or national interest. What we see today is that, politicians are more likely to prioritize their party success over bipartisan solutions. And what this does is kind of drives an ideological division and a lack of compromise of the other side. The rise of partisan media outlets that further divides us, because how it works is that they present a one-sided view, trying to reinforce, the message that they have and antagonizing the opposition, as opposed to just trying to find common solutions. Going along with partisanship, polarization is where partisanship exists, and it just drives it even further to the poles, to the ends. There is an increasing ideological distance between political parties. In today's political parties, it's the Democrats and Republicans, and they are moving further and further apart in their views and policies. Political discussions are constantly framed in an us versus them. It's not a matter of just we're Americans, it's they're a Democrat, they're a Republican. Um, as polarization intensifies, these ideologies becoming more extreme, there is less and less moderate and centrist viewpoints. There is little willingness to find common ground or cooperate across the aisle, especially because of pressure from your fellow partisan. The idea is that, well, you're betraying us because you're going to work with them. And that's very antithetical to the idea of American democracy, where we're supposed to work together for everything. It does extend beyond politics. This isn't just something that you'll see on the floor of the House or Senate or anything. It does shape our cultural and social divides within our society. It spills over. When people talk about, like, I voted for guy A or person B. It doesn't just stay there at the election booth. It does spill out over, what we watch on TV, how we act in public, that kind of thing, who we determine are our friends, who we associate with. So that's kind of one of the big issues that does face, our society as a whole, instead of just politics. Political gridlock is kind of one of the consequences of partisanship, where, the extreme divide leads to nothing getting done in the actual government. Any kind of action just stalls due to the inability to reach compromise. Filibustering is a very, very popular and well-known technique to prevent the other side from getting anything done. This is also kind of going back to what I mentioned before about, like, the whole minority versus majority thing. This is a tactic for a minority to kind of exert pressure and influence on things, because a simple majority doesn't necessarily mean things are going to get done in Congress. Like I said, there's a lot of nuance in it, but 51 votes in the Senate doesn't necessarily mean something is immediately passed. There are methods for the minority, the political opponents, to essentially delay or prevent things from actually happening. We do see that this is kind of an issue through voting patterns and public polls. The graphic I have on the screen kind of shows, as the years go on, the public opinion of opposing parties are just considered continuously being seen as unfavorable. It used to be fairly moderate to a certain degree, but as time goes on, the polarization just keeps happening, and it's just, they're the bad guys, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. So you do see it kind of increasing throughout every single election cycle. It just, everyone says, oh, this is the worst it's ever been, it's the worst it's ever been. I can't say that for sure, but it certainly, people feel that way, just from an aggregate of public opinion polls and how people do vote. I mentioned before just the idea of political gridlock. The consequence of this is just ineffective government. We have a government, we elect people to it, but if they can't actually do anything, what is the point of the government? If they can't actually get legislation passed, or people appointed to things, nothing gets done, everything gets delayed, and it just becomes a game, a political game. So citizens do tend to lose a lot of trust in elected officials and the process as a whole, when it's just focused on these partisan games of just, which side can win, and what really is a win. Is it just getting elected, or is it actually getting your agenda passed and actually passing laws? When political cooperation does become rare, it's just the democratic process as a whole is undermined. And the ability to address the needs of the people decreases, and extremism begins to replace reasoned debate. Another popular issue is called gerrymandering. What gerrymandering is the manipulation of electoral districts, to favor one particular political party, a group, a specific candidate, whether they're an incumbent or not. What it does is it creates an electoral advantage by ensuring that one party wins more seats than their share of the vote would suggest. It is used globally to criticize unfair redistricting practices, regardless of the actual shapes. It stems all the way from, you'll see the image, it stems literally all the way from the beginning of the country. Elbridge Gerry was the governor of Massachusetts, and was the one who signed a redistricting plan to benefit his party, the Democratic Republican Party. And what it was is that he was mocked essentially in the press. And you'll see the image here is, how ridiculous some of these congressional districts actually look. When the only real motivation is to essentially kind of put certain people in certain districts. When, it's that not just like a grid, it looks like a gerrymander, Jerry from the governor's name and salamander, because that's the kind of creature it looks like. There are two ways you can gerrymander something. There is cracking, which dilutes the political power of a group by spreading them across multiple districts. And then packing, which concentrates the opposing group into a single district. So essentially you're tossing them a bone saying, you guys are just in that district, we get the rest. Or where you're splitting them up so they don't have a majority in any kind of district, and you're trying to control all the congressional or electoral districts. What this ends up doing is it really does undermine fair representation. Districts are drawn to favor one party or a group. It's just disproportionate in legislatures when you're looking at, who's represented, like, based on political party, because that's where it does stem from. It stems from what political party made the districts. We do make new electoral districts every 10 years after a census based on representation and the numbers that we have in each state. So this is kind of a struggle that people face literally every 10 years when whoever is currently in power pretty much has a lot of authority and say in determining what the districts will actually look like, and what party, based on demographics and statistics and former voting patterns, will end up being, whether it's going to be a Republican district or a Democrat district. It does reduce electoral competitiveness. It creates those safe seats where it's going to be a Republican or Democrat seat just based on those voting patterns, guaranteeing that party is usually always going to win in that area. And it just leads to fewer actual competitive elections, and that reduces voter choice and engagement, because if you know that you're a minority in there, it's very disheartening to know that, like, well, if I'm a Democrat, it's always going to be Republican. Like, why bother voting, kind of situation. A lot of these issues are going to overlap in the problems that they, the consequences that they have, as well as solutions to address them. Because, like I mentioned before, this increases partisanship, as I mentioned, the topic I mentioned before, because politicians will cater to party extremes rather than moderates, because they know that their district is going to be filled with people of their party. I mentioned before, it diminishes voter influence and engagement. People will just feel like their votes don't matter, and it will decrease voter turnout and trust in the electoral process. And one of the big issues is it does entrench incumbency. An incumbent is someone that is already elected, and they're essentially running for re-election. This is a tactic to manipulate it so that they can stay in power, as opposed to truly trying to actually run and convince their constituency that they're worthy to be re-elected. One of the most talked about topics is politics and money. Probably one of the most argued about topics too, and how it relates to our political process and what role money does play. Because people say money is the root of all evil, and of course it would fit into politics. The influence of money has created an imbalance where wealthy individuals, corporations, and special interests can significantly shape policy decisions and elections. The cost of campaigning elections are ever increasing. They are as expensive as they have ever been in history. And that makes the need for more and more donations more impactful in the current political environment. Money tends to decide a lot of things when it comes to political candidates and their future. The decisions that they do make while they are serving in a position of power. Large campaign donations and lobbying efforts allow the wealthy to have a disproportionate influence over lawmakers. Where they are essentially, they gave me the most money, I will do what they tell me because they're the ones that are going to keep giving me money and they're the ones that are keeping me in power, not the actual people that vote. It does undermine the principle of equal representation, as elected officials may prioritize those desires of the big donors over just average citizens, even though they're the ones that technically vote. They're not the ones that are influencing what decisions they make because they're still going to vote them. It kind of harkens back to the partisanship thing. It's like, well, he's a Republican and I'm a Republican, so I'm going to vote for him, but he gets the money from there. Where they're a Democrat, I'm a Democrat. They're not listening to what I want, but they're in my party, so I'm just going to keep voting for them. As a result of the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United versus the FEC, super PACs kind of, even before the decision, super PACs were kind of very prevalent during campaigning, and what exactly their role was during campaigns and how they associated with candidates that they supported. Because they can, as a result of the Supreme Court decision, they can raise unlimited funds from individuals, corporations, unions, and spend that money independently to influence the elections. So although they can't directly coordinate with the candidates, they're often run ads and campaigns that benefit political interests and individuals. It's kind of just like an unspoken rule, that they're a super PAC, they're supporting this candidate. Even though they can't say, hey, run this ad in this town or anything like that, they're helping them no matter what. And they have unlimited funds at their disposal. Dark money is something that refers to political spending by groups that is not required to be disclosed, who their donors are. The idea of dark. So people are donating money and, you don't have to find out how did you get $10 million in your campaign war chest? Who did that come from? That's the idea of dark money is you don't really know who's pulling those strings, who's the one that's trying to influence the politicians. The influx of money makes it incredibly difficult for grassroots candidates to compete. Those are the average people. The original concept of the citizen politician, the person who decides to, volunteer their time to, aid in the political process of their constituents. These are the people that, aren't career politicians or wealthy people that want to run and help better their communities. The whole concept of money kind of being a huge barrier to candidacy is a big issue because they just can't keep up. If you're relying on 10,000 votes, in a poor rural area or something like that, the person that's getting donations from, Monsanto or another corporation that has a direct interest in the region over the actual constituents, it's going to depend on how they can get their message out. And money, that's what money means to them. It means that it helps them get their message out. Public perception of the political process is also negatively impacted as a result of money's influence, as citizens just feel that elections are bought. They're bought and sold. The candidates are bought and sold. So it's not that it's a will. It's not decided by the will of the actual people. It just breeds cynicism, reduces voter turnout, and erodes trust in the democratic process. And you'll see in the graph that I got that shows the actual the amount of money that is coming in, billions and billions of dollars. Campaigns are considered the most expensive expenditure in our country. One of I shouldn't say in the most, aside from government budgets, but that is billions and billions and billions of dollars just to play TV ads and just to put things in the newspaper, attending rallies and paying for people to support you, to speak on your behalf, I should say. A lot of money is spent into campaigns. And then moving over from money to lobbying and special interests, hand in hand. Lobbying is the practice of influencing government decisions on behalf of specific groups or causes, plays a significant role in the shaping of public policy. Lobbyists are often hired by corporations, trade associations, labor unions, or advocacy groups. So there is it's not all negative. It's not just greedy businessmen that are sitting in a corner waiting in a lobby. The idea is that, the original concept of lobby is people waiting in a lobby in the Capitol building to speak to their government officials to essentially try and put direct pressure on them. There are good causes and there are bad causes. While lobbying can provide valuable information to decision makers, it's also just sparked widespread concerns of, why are these people talking directly to a politician when they're not one of their constituents? Special interest groups, which do represent specific economic, social, or political agendas, they 100% rely on lobbying to push their goals, because essentially what it is you need a piece of legislation passed or you need a piece of legislation denied. You need to actually talk to the people who are voting on it, because we're a representative democracy, we're a republic. So, even though these people were voted in by the average citizen, they're the ones that actually make the decision. And the lobbyists and the special interests are the ones that need to influence those politicians, whether it's for or against the interest of their constituents. The revolving door aspect is, between government and lobbying firms. It exacerbates everything. Former government officials frequently transition into lobbying roles for industries that they once regulated. And it blurs the line between public service and private gain. This practice does tend to lead to what's called regulatory capture, where industries successfully lobby to weaken or dismantle regulations designed to protect public welfare, such as environmental protections, consumer safety standards, and in the process prioritizes profits over broader societal needs. The idea that, there are politicians in there who do go there for power and money, and then they set themselves up for, I'm not going to be congressman ever, forever. I'm going to let these guys, give me money. I'm going to do the decisions that they want, and then they're going to set me up with a cushy job. And, I know how everything is run over here. That's what people are worried about. That's kind of the problems that, lobbying, it's kind of an Ouroboros, an unending, the snake kind of in a perpetual circle. It's these people are just kind of going around and around and around in the same industry. Wealthy donors and corporations wield significant power through these political contributions and campaign funding. It sways elections, it sways policy decisions. It just goes back to the whole idea of money being involved in politics and granting influence, and granting access to these lawmakers, because lawmakers may not necessarily just say, hey, my door's open to any person that is in my district that wants to come talk to me. There are absolute barriers of entry for people to actually communicate with them. You're talking to one of their aides or something like that indirectly, and you don't know if your message is necessarily actually getting through to them. Whereas people who are donating heavy amounts of money to their campaigns are going to have sit-down dinners with these people, and actually hear what their concerns are about. These disparities, it is there is a lack of transparency in the policymaking process, as just the fact that these people can meet with these congressmen and these politicians, and we don't necessarily know about it. They're private individuals and they're absolutely entitled to sit and meet with anyone that they actually want. But there's no transparency in regard to what they talked about. If they, said, yeah, I'm going to vote the way you want me to vote because you gave me $10 million to my campaign, through this super PAC that I'm not officially associated with, kind of situation. So it does kind of, it's hard to regulate and it is hard to kind of monitor. And that's one of the big issues, that there is no transparency for it. And ultimately, it just does, it erodes the trust in the democratic process. I will kind of hammer this home every single topic we go, is that it just disheartens people. They know that these are problems, and they know that as a result of these issues, that their voice matters less and less. Um, The next issue, which kind of it's perennial issue. It kind of comes around pretty much every time there's a presidential election, is the Electoral College. I actually gave a presentation last week about the Electoral College and more encompassing. But what the Electoral College is that it's a mechanism, a procedure established by the U.S. Constitution for selecting the president. Each state is allocated a certain amount of electors based on the number of senators and representatives in the state. There are 538 electors, and 270 are needed to win the presidency. This is one of those aspects of our republic, our constitutional republic, where it's not a direct democracy. Whoever is president is not voted based on just the number of votes that are in the country, based on eligible voters. We essentially are electing someone to elect the president. So that's kind of just added that extra buffer, and kind of like how the Roman Republic operated, how Congress runs for us. We elect someone to vote for something, and it's the same way with the president. The problems with the Electoral College are due to some of the how it's set up, and why, the issue that it isn't just a simple majority, because there's the idea that it is a disproportionate representation. If you look at the map that I have on there, this is the past election. These are the vote total, the electoral vote totals that go into who someone wins the state. That's the idea, is that these votes go to that candidate. Most states have a winner take all system. So this is where that 51% decides everything. So if 51% of the people in one state vote for one candidate, vote for an elector for that candidate, then the whole state is in support of the candidate, with the exception of two states, Maine and Nebraska. So people don't really agree that, this kind of procedure, this kind of process is reflective of equal representation. You also have the idea that, not every, different states are represented, more or less than each other. When we're looking at Wyoming versus California, there are way more people in California than there are in Wyoming. But the idea of the way it's set up is that every single state will have a minimum of 3 electoral votes, because they have 2 senators and at minimum 1 congressman. The idea is that because there is a cap on how many Congress people are in the House, that there could be 10 million people in one state and 5 in another, but there's still going to be 3 electoral votes in that 5-person state, regardless of how many people are in the larger states. Because there's only a floor, there's only a ceiling, and the floor and ceiling are not equitable, I should say. Because there's only going to be so much that someone can get. There's only a maximum amount. Kind of like the big kind of problem with it is just the idea that it's a popular vote versus the electoral vote. Whether or not 51% of just people voting should decide it, or if it is this game of winner takes all, and disproportionate representation based on the states. That's what really determines that. It's happened 5 times in history in our elections, where the person who won the popular vote did not win the electoral vote, so they were not the president. Most recently in 2016, but as early as 1824, it happened. Couple decades after our country, started under the Constitution. And it was an issue then, and it's an issue now. And that's what kind of one of the big debates is about, is this equitable for us? Is this truly a representative democracy if this is how we pick who leads us? The idea is that there are faithless electors. Faithless electors are people who do not vote for who they say they were going to vote for. They are pledged to a specific candidate, and people vote for that candidate, and they get picked as the elector. A lot of, it's a majority of states do have rules against it, but there are states where you can vote for another person. I don't want to, vote for that person. I'm going to have a protest vote, something like that. Is that truly representative? I voted for you to vote for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, but you're not going to vote for them. Like, you're lying to me. So, there's that kind of aspect of it, that it's not truly representative. It's not it's not putting forth the will of the people. And lastly, the idea that the whole electoral system acts as a suppression of third-party candidates. It emboldens the duopoly of between two parties because they're so entrenched that really people just think, well, it's not. It goes back to the partisanship idea that it's either them or us. So I'm not going to vote for a third person because then the other people are going to win. Even though I don't agree with both, I agree with them less. The lesser of two evils kind of situation. So what that does is it limits political diversity in political choice for actual voters, where you are kind of just stuck voting for two people. Talking about incumbents and term limits. I mentioned incumbents before, specifically talking about like gerrymandering. This is the idea that, a majority of citizens do overwhelmingly support term limits for congressional seats in the House and Senate. Support for term limits is universal among voters, and it breaches political, geographic, and demographic divides. There are Republicans, there are Democrats, there are conservatives and liberals and independents, all support term limits in a majority. As recent as 2021, 80% of voters approve of placing term limits on members of Congress. Half of all voters say that they would be more likely to support a member of Congress who has been opposed to congressional term limits. I'm sorry, I'm rereading a line. Yes, okay. Has been opposed to congressional term limits. But only if they announce that they suddenly would support term limits. So if someone had been entrenched in politics for decades, people are more likely to even reelect them if they say, you know what, I'm kind of done, and I think no one else should have, everyone else should have term limits. Kind of flipping that script on that. Not necessarily a hypocrite, but just the idea that they are able to support a position like that, even though they didn't necessarily follow those kinds of rules. Nationally, only the president is currently restricted by term limits, 2 terms. And the idea is that there should be an effort to kind of put these on senators and Congress people as well. The lack of term limits for congressional members does lead to entrenched incumbents who often remain in office for decades, accumulating significant political power and influence. This creates a system where long-serving lawmakers may prioritize personal or party interests over the needs of their actual constituents, leading to stagnation in the legislative process. We look at people who have been in Congress for 30, 40 years, and people say like, oh, we're worse off than we've ever been. And it's like, well, why do you keep electing them? It's the kind of questions you got to ask, that people do ask. And it's, the idea that we do need different people in office because they're not kind of doing anything, especially, goes back to the gridlock and the partisanship, and the gerrymandering, is that these people are staying in power and not actually doing anything, and just kind of working with the special interests that are the ones that are funding their campaigns. Entrenched incumbency can stifle new ideas and perspectives. It reduces the opportunity for fresh leadership, just new faces. I talked about the idea that, there is a lack of turnover. So these grassroots candidates, these people with not any kind of political agency who would like to make some kind of change, don't really have the ability to do it because these people have been in power for so long, and they spend their efforts to prevent them from being removed from power. Extended time in office does foster closer relationships with lobbyists, donors, and special interests. The power of incumbency also makes it difficult for challengers. Incumbents have greater access to campaign funds, media coverage, and established political networks. It's all works together. It contributes to the idea of political gridlock, and it does undermine democratic representation. Looking at voting issues, voting in the United States faces a number of significant challenges that affect the accessibility, fairness, and trustworthiness of the electoral process. We have issues like voter disenfranchisement, which does remain a persistent issue. Whether you agree or not, there's the idea of placing strict voter ID laws, limiting the amount of polling places that are available for people to go to, limiting the availability of those polling places that exist, the hours in which they're open, as well as, purging voter rolls. These people haven't voted in 10 years. Why are they still on the list? Get rid of them. They need to re-register kind of situation. These measures often create additional hurdles for voters, and it does discourage participation in the democratic process. I mentioned before gerrymandering. We explored that. The practice undermines the principle of fair representation. It dilutes voting power in certain communities, and it distorts the outcome of elections. Voters may face accessibility issues. The idea that, people with maybe disabilities have no way of actually getting to the voting booths. People who don't necessarily speak or read English well, whether they're natives or not. And then, those who do live in remote areas, in the middle of nowhere. We provide mail service for them, but, how do they vote? The lack of proper accommodations and literacy assistance and convenient located polling places does create more unnecessary barriers. Election security is another pressing issue, a very controversial issue. But we do have a lot of places that have outdated voting equipment. Whether or not they use computers or not, they are prone to cyber attacks, where it does cast doubt on the actual integrity of the process. So the idea is that there is no national standard for voting practices and what equipment is used by state and by municipality. These are up to the states to decide. There's no national standard. So, one like Florida can use one kind of type of equipment and New York can use another. And the idea that, it's a matter of how much investment goes into these voting these methods of voting. Like I mentioned before, whether it's punching a hole in a ballot from 2000, or sticking something in a computer and it just constantly reads errors, to just having paper ballots and people putting it in a box and someone trying to light it on fire, or pour water in it or anything like that. These are just things that can happen, and not necessarily that they're malicious or not. It's just a matter of actual election integrity, of whether the vote you're casting is going to be counted. That's what really people want to make sure. And then there's also just the idea that there are misinformation campaigns to erode the public's confidence in voting, and the idea of spreading the confusion that oh, my vote didn't count. They said it didn't count, but it could have counted. The idea is you want to be informed as much as possible, and we do have to prevent people from misinforming people. Voter turnout is it's not, I wouldn't say it's always talked about, but it is a very interesting thing to look at. Only about 2/3 of people that are eligible to vote actually do vote. So that's a third of the country of eligible voters that do not actually participate in our elections. And that's in national elections. The number is even lower for local elections, state elections and local elections. We have seen a rise in voter participation in recent presidential elections, but it's still at that 2/3 mark, because usually it bounces between 50%, 55% to 60%. And it went as far as 66% in 2020. The idea is that, if a third of the people aren't actually voting, is it really a representative democracy? Is the person that's being picked actually, the one that the majority of people want? And this kind of goes into the idea of voter apathy, because it works in conjunction with that, like that many issues that we've discussed all throughout everything. It's just the assessment that, do voters feel that they are heard? That if their vote actually matters as more, it matters the same as this person, or if it even matters at all. Um, there's a lack of understanding of the voting system, and candidates, some people walk into a voting booth and they don't even know who is on this ballot. It's an idea of civic education as well. Um, just taken together, all these things taken together, these challenges do highlight a need for reforms to ensure a more equitable and accessible voting process for all citizens. And so those are the main issues I went over. And then these are some possible solutions that can be addressed, that can be used to address a lot of these issues. There are a variety of ways that you can look at anything from, anything that I mentioned. If someone can come up with 100 different alternatives or proposals to address it. These are just some very popular ways that that people can address these specific issues. From the first one that I talked about with partisanship, all it takes is some bipartisan efforts. Like, if there are good people on both sides, all it takes is cross-party initiatives, as well as independent commissions, people who aren't associated with either side, to kind of move things along. You have to encourage civil discourse and critical thinking and education to combat misinformation and to reduce these ideological divides. I mentioned before the idea of the idea that there are a limited amount of people to choose from, that there's no third party candidate, and implementing a ranked choice voting method is a way to kind of divert that partisanship, because it won't be an us versus them. Now it's I actually have to fight for myself, instead of just relying on people to hate the other side, because there's too many people for them to choose from now. So making sure that there is actual third party participation is a good way to kind of reduce that polarization. Looking at gerrymandering, a lot of states do have these kinds of laws and rules in place, where you would establish an independent, nonpartisan redistricting commission. So every time there's a census, this independent commission, regardless of who's in control of the state legislator or who's in control of the governorship, they're the ones redrawing the districting maps. And you would just want to use transparent criteria, such as compactness and community representation, because you want to prevent manipulative boundary drawing that favors a party just outright. You do look at some districts in certain states that are literally just a grid. And it's obviously not going to be that easy, because it does depend on population. But the idea is you do want to avoid those salamanders. You don't want a gerrymander. You don't want a little stick in one area and then two blobs on the end, like a dumbbell or something like that. Because how the people that are in that congressional district, why is my next door neighbor not in my congressional district? How do we not have the same representative when we have essentially the same issues? So there's a lot of criteria that can be considered aside from party affiliation. Reducing the influence of money in politics. I will actually just say, as a whole, a lot of these things would require passing legislation, even a constitutional amendment. And some things are as simple as just civic education initiatives based, nonprofits that they can do. It's just making sure people actually go out to vote or something like that, or just that they are informed on who the candidate is, that ballots are mailed to people beforehand, that kind of thing. So there's, a lot of these things when looking at them. Some are going to require heavy lifting from political participants, from politicians, and others can be relied on the citizenry as a whole. Reducing money in reduce the influence of money in politics. It's the idea of just campaign finance reform. It's been visited before by Congress in the past, by enacting public financing systems, capping contributions. I mean, there are laws that say you can only donate X amount of money to a political candidate. And, as the current law is based on judicial review, these super PACs can exist. The idea that, as long as they're not associated with the candidate, it's political free speech. People can say what they want about candidates, whether they support them or don't, and use their money for that matter. But we do want to increase transparency in political spending. And that's typically by, maybe passing a law to require full disclosure of donors, including super PACs and 501s. Regulating special interests in lobbying. You can enhance lobbying regulations to limit that revolving door between government and private industries. You can mandate public disclosure of lobbying activities and require ethical or even legal guidelines to prevent undue influence on policy decisions. This is kind of a situation where, the idea is, how free is a person to do what they want, a congressperson, you can't tell me what job I have after Congress kind of situation. But it's the idea is that's something that would have to kind of rely on people in Congress to make those decisions about, whether or not they actually have virtue or integrity about it. Reforming, I lost my place. Oh, no, I didn't mention. Okay, reforming the idea of lobbying. I mentioned before already, regulating lobbying by requiring those guidelines. Reforming the Electoral College. I went into this in depth in my last presentation. Some of the basic ones would be to just flat out abolish the Electoral College, and that would any kind of thing reforming the Electoral College typically would require a constitutional amendment. Abolishing the Electoral College would require that, where it would just go to a national popular vote, where whoever gets that 50.00001% is president. There is something called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. This is kind of something that's seen as a workaround of a constitutional amendment. It is not likely that it would impact anything. The idea is that there are X amount of states that say, whoever gets the popular vote, we will dedicate our electoral votes to. And the idea is that if there are enough states that reaches to 270, which is required for presidency, that they will be the ones that can they say, yep, we have the majority. If the majority of people do vote for it, then it's going to go that way. That's going to be something that will be bogged down by partisanship, as it usually is, kind of divided based on political party affiliation, and in terms of supporting or not supporting the Electoral College. So, but that is something that people are trying to work on. Introducing term limits. The idea of setting reasonable term limits for members of Congress to reduce careerism in politics and encourage fresh perspectives and leadership. I mentioned before, the vast majority of people do support term limits. It is something that would either have to be set to law by Congress itself, so it's essentially them putting the rules on themselves, or a constitutional amendment. And that's just something that takes a lot of effort. But an idea to counter it, saying, well, we need leadership, we need experienced people to run in Congress and stuff like that. You would counter it by just saying that, you can complement it with measures to ensure that, even though the person that's elected is only there for X amount of time, that there is a continuity, a staff continuity of people that are part of the institutional staff of that specific office, that will kind of always be there to kind of usher in the new people every single time. And then lastly, improving voter access and trust. There's a lot of things that we can do to improve how our voting process is, to make sure that most people do vote. We can adopt automatic voter registration. So the day you get a license, you're automatically registered to vote. Here at the library, you can just come into the library, get your library card, and register to vote. That kind of thing. So some kind of system for that. Once you turn 18, your Social Security number is associated with it. You get to vote. That's the kind of thing you're just added to your state system. Same day registration. There are deadlines to register to vote, and the idea is that well, I didn't know, that kind of thing is that if you can if you can register the same day that you vote, because you find out you weren't actually registered, that kind of solves that, as well as just expanding early voting, and on top of that, mail-in voting. So a lot of states are kind of adopting these practices. So that just expands how people can vote and when they can vote. The other ideas are making election day a national holiday. People work on a Tuesday. Election day is always on a Tuesday. It's a normal business day for most people. Not never, a lot of states do have laws where you are required to be allowed to go vote, but not everyone does. So that would solve that. And then as well as updating the voting infrastructure by maybe implementing a national standard on voting equipment, or how people vote, the hours of which people vote, anything like that. That is my presentation. I mentioned before, none of these solutions really are perfect, nor universally agreed upon, whether those problems are actual problems or not. The idea is that, it's the beauty of living in a democracy where we can kind of debate and discuss things. And then the idea is to work on compromise. The only thing I kind of just hope is that you do walk away with a little slightly better understanding of the democratic aspects of our country and our government, and the issues that it does have, and what we can do moving forward with it. So thank you.
Thank you.